Well, good morning, everyone. And I think we're pretty much good to go now as people are coming through the turnstiles through Zoom webinar. My name is Jonathan Wareham. I'm the Chief Executive of Localis Think Tank, and many thanks to everyone today for registering to attend our webinar, in which we're going to debate the findings and directions of a recent report which Localis wrote in partnership with the management consultancy Human Engine. And what we were looking at was the vexed issue of contemporary council commercial activity. Our report, The Commercial Edge, Renewing the Case for the Local Investment State, made the case in the context of the current economic, financial and political situation. Really, in terms of the top line, we're calling for a continuation, reform and improvement of council commercial activity. We had to recognise this is a vexed, a contentious issue. Because of high-profile failures, we can't whitewash or dream away they happened. And there are and have been justified and justifiable concerns from within and without the sector, especially from central government, about what the impact to already weakened local government finances might be when council commercial activity goes awry. That's kind of the negative case. The positive case is there has been a long track history of often judicial and wise investment within their area by local authorities getting it right, going back as far as we can trace to the 12th century when London Bridge needed rebuilding. King John granted land for pasture to the City of London, from which the London Bridge was renewed, and the legacy exists today in the Bridge Trust, a wealthy philanthropic venture arising from that. Moving more to the present day, got the great example of Birmingham. Joseph Chamberlain's gas and water municipalism transformed the living conditions of Brummies in the late 19th century, was widely modelled elsewhere, and taking us more to the present day. Now, today's situation is framed as it has to be by the pandemic and all sorts of hits to all kinds of revenue sources that have been brought and trained by lockdown and isolation. The Institute for Fiscal Studies nailed it when they called it a perfect storm, simultaneously increasing spending and reducing revenue-raising capacity. Beyond this, we've got what we have already, a local government funding gap, and the promise of a spending review later in the autumn, which probably won't answer everything around the long-term sustainability of local government finances, but does suggest that, if anything, our councils will have to be even more resourceful if they're not going to be reduced to an infantilized begging bowl status, as good old Eric Pickles used to say. So the consideration is, what do we risk losing, not just for the present, but for perhaps future generations, if this spirit of local entrepreneurialism is lost or diluted? What potential gain might otherwise be evaporated? Now, there are bad apple examples. We don't need to list or enumerate them, but there are countervailing on the other side great examples of good practice, which we in Human Engine were able to track in our report, from Cornwall to Wealdon and all places in between. And this kind of, the good stuff councils do suggests that when undertaken with diligence, professionalism, armed with local knowledge and conviction, commercialism can still unlock latent place potential and deliver seen as well as unseen benefits for councils and communities. And maybe some of the inconspicuous benefits, that sense of helping councils accelerate their transformation journey by learning from best practice from the private sector, is, for me, it stood out as something that's very important. So we published our report a few weeks ago with Human Engine, and in it, please look at it. We'll send a link to anyone who hasn't got it. We've got lessons and recommendations for local government leaders, those who scrutinise our councils and their governance, a very important role, as well as central government in their job overseeing all this, from MHCLG to the NAO. So essentially, our job today is to look at the debate, see if there's a way of reframing and reforming this, and that's probably enough from me by way of preamble. Now, we're blessed with a really top panel of experts to debate this from all sides. Great pleasure to introduce Andrew Burns, Associate Director of SIPFA, Also great pleasure to have Jonathan Noble from our research partners, Human Engine, Trevor Scott, great example of a practitioner in Wealdon District Council, and hopefully later from the local government leadership perspective from our Localist board member and member of Hillingdon Council, David Simmons, MP for Northwood and Pinner. So it's going to be a very simple, straightforward and hopefully enjoyable format. I'm going to invite each of our speakers in alphabetical order to sum up in 4 or 5 minutes, if you can, what you think is most important from this report and the wider agenda for Council's continued commercial activity. Once we're done with that, we'll frame a couple of questions between the panel, but really invite participants today, lob in your questions in the Q&A panel, keep the debate going, and we'll box and cox with that until the time ends on the dot at 12:30 for this. So in terms of social media, we're tweeting this from our Localist Twitter handle. As ever, we have a Twitter handle which is Commercial Edge, #CommercialEdge, the name of the report. So without any further ado, Andrew, if I could ask you, unmuted already, if I could ask you to say your piece and get us off to a flying start. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. So Andy Burns, Associate Director at CIPFA. I guess my credentials for this conversation are primarily, 13 years as Director of Finance and Resources at Staffordshire County Council, where I was responsible for many things, including investment, commercial and procurement strategies. My role at CIPFA is currently leading on our relationship with local government as a sector. So firstly, I think this is a really welcome report that sheds light on an important debate, which has too often been characterised by heat rather than light. There are a number of dimensions to commercialism, and they're not all controversial. It means different things to different people, but for me and for CIPFA, it's more than just generating income from commercial investments or from trading. It's more than just being better at procurement. It's about a culture and a mindset of being customer focused, about creating public value. It's about being innovative. It's about being pacey. It's about investing in talents and skills, and where appropriate, failing fast. And in a public sector context, it's about being able to do all that in a way that's characterised by openness and transparency, and not hiding behind a cloak of commercial confidentiality, which sometimes happens. And I think as part of the bargain for being commercial, as part of the bargain for working with the private sector or trading as a council, in exchange for reasonable profits, there needs to be an acceptance for good governance and good scrutiny to enable the decisions that have been taken by councils in this commercial space to be properly understood and explained by local populations for whom we are ultimately all accountable. So much of the controversy has been about councils borrowing chiefly from the Public Works Loans Board to invest in commercial property, primarily for yield. Now, the government have disallowed that now, and CIPFA have supported that view. Commercial yield comes with commercial risk, and from a public policy perspective, that's not an appropriate use for public money. Public institutions need to act in the public interest, not in organisational interest. And councils borrowing from PWB in that way aren't subject to the due diligence requirements of the market. However, that's a very, very small part of being commercial. There's plenty of scope for councils to be innovative and creative and commercial in many other dimensions of what they do in their local places. And the best councils have been very, very good at that for a long time. The scope to borrow to invest in place shaping, the scope to borrow to invest in regeneration and housing and providing public services and commercial activity can play a really important role in ensuring that councils can generate additional income to support local public services in their place. But that is necessary, but it won't always be sufficient. So councils who know what they're doing, are strategy led and understand the risks that they are taking, they can use commercial activity as a really important strand of their local approaches. But ultimately, that will not be sufficient. And for councils to be on a financially sustainable footing, we need a proper long-term funding settlement. And hopefully, when we get to the spending review later in the year, there'll be some steps in the right direction there. But I think commercial activity done well, I think, can play an important role. And don't just focus on the things that you can't do. There's plenty of space to focus on the things councils can do and do well. And I think your report highlights some reasonable and some good approaches to enable that to happen.
Andrew, many thanks indeed for truly getting off to a flyer there. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to invite Jonathan Noble from Managing Director of Human Engine to our research partners. Please expand on what we derive from the report and what we think is important going forwards. Over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks Andrew. Morning all, I'm Jonathan Noble. As Jonathan's kindly introduced me, I'm the Managing Director of Human Engine. So we're a Financial Times top-ranked management consultancy. We work with clients across the public sector, but predominantly we work with local government, and we've worked with local authorities at all tiers since we established the business in 2018. One of the things that we are incredibly passionate about is helping public sector organisations to use commercial skills to create, improve, develop modern public services, or if you prefer, to sharpen their commercial edge, which is the inspiration for the title for our report. We take a really broad approach to this. So as Andrew's mentioned, this is not a unidimensional issue. And it frustrates me a little bit because in no other part of public life or public sector working do we ever try and boil something down to a unidimensional issue. We recognise whether we're doing transformation programmes, digital change, community engagement, whatever the initiative is, there's always multiple factors and complexity to be taken into consideration there. For some reason, with the issue of commercial, too often it gets reduced down to this sort of sticky syrup of risky property investments, and those make for great high-profile headlines in the trade publications, but they don't reflect all of the nuance and complexity and potential for commercialism to improve public services and public life. So when we had the opportunity to partner with Localis on this research, we jumped at the opportunity, delighted to have co-written the report, and the findings and the recommendations, in my somewhat biased view, couldn't be more topical. Previous research showed that in 2019, 72% of local authorities said that they expected their income from commercial sources to grow over the following year. Well, of course, none of us knew what was to come in the following year, but the latest figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies show that almost 3 billion in revenues have been lost as a result of COVID-19. People who work in the sector will be aware of losses of income in areas like parking and leisure, but across the piece about 3 billion. So those optimistic projections about councils achieving a degree of financial sustainability through a growth in commercial income, unfortunately, has not only not been met, but there's been a devastating impact on local authority finances as a result of the pandemic. Meanwhile, on the supply side of things, we've got big changes coming to the public procurement regime in this country, probably the biggest changes in at least 20 years, actually, if not longer. So one of the strategic objectives of the government's Green Paper on procurement is to drive recovery through the public sector's approximately £290 billion annual spend with third-party suppliers. I was at the Public Procurement Global Revolution conference online last week, which is hosted by Nottingham Law School and Trowers and Hamlins. We had colleagues from the Cabinet Office there, and they said they received more than 600 organisational responses to the consultation on the procurement bill. So 600 separate organisations, not individuals, responding to that, which anecdotally seems to be a record for a consultation on something like procurement. So there's clearly a lot of interest in the topic of commercialism and an awful lot invested in it. I'm really glad through the report, and I hope through the debate today to be able to make a case for a more entrepreneurial brand of local government and to extol the virtues of taking a strategic, multifaceted, complex approach to it. And I'm delighted to be here in such esteemed company to discuss that with colleagues today.
Many thanks indeed, Jonathan, for taking us through. So next up, great pleasure, Trevor Scott, Chief Executive, Wealdon District Council, great exemplar of commercialism in practice. Take it away, please.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jonathan. Yes, Jonathan said I'm Chief Executive of Wealdon District Council. And for those of you admiring my backdrop, I can, of course, do a very quick plug for my organisation. That is actually the southern part of my district territory there, the Seven Sisters in East Sussex. For those of you who don't know where Wealdon is, it's the largest rural district within East Sussex. and we are just about to launch a new tourism brand, actually, Explore Wealdon. So if you're thinking of a staycation this summer, I can certainly recommend coming to have a look at the coast and the countryside that we offer within our district. So that's my box ticked for my tourism team. So on to the conversation around commercial, and obviously delighted to be having an opportunity to talk about the paper that Human Engine and Localis have produced, because I think it's a really timely document. I think we've seen over the last few years a spike in activity for the local government sector within the sphere and under the banner of commercial activity. And what we've seen most recently is a pushback against some of the more extreme investments that we're seeing across the sector. And that's ended up painting the concept of being a commercial organisation as almost being something that's bad for the sector. And I think what we need to do through the document that's been produced, and what I think the document does really well, is reframe the conversation around what we mean by commercial and what the role of local government as a sector is in delivering commercial projects. And to me, the USP really of local government is that we know our place and our people better than anybody else. That's what we offer through our democratic accountability and our democratic representation, and through the knowledge of the officers that work within the sector. And the whole issue around commercial for me is delivering projects and improvements within our local place in a different way that allows us to address the issue of financial austerity that Andrew talked about. And if we wind the clock back sort of 15, 20 years, local government was funded in a very different way, not only from central government, but of course, we had a free hand in how much council tax we raised. The kind of combination of a reduction in government grant together with a capping on council tax meant that we faced financial austerity. But it didn't take away the fact that we still needed to deliver improvements for our local residents to continue investing in place. So the whole issue for me around commercial is actually around using our knowledge to solve problems within our local area to improve our place. And an awful lot of what we do at Wealdon is look at opportunities to invest in things like infrastructure or commercial projects, job creation, GPs, surgeries, even new leisure centres. These are all core services and core infrastructure that are needed by our communities in place, which if we can't find a financial way to deliver them, don't get delivered by the market. And so with using our knowledge, we're looking for ways of delivering things that address gaps within the market that the marketplace can't deliver because it's not financially viable to their profit levels, but which we can deliver and achieve through a different conversation and a different balance. And so when I look at things like housing development, we find in Wealdon a lack of smaller units that meet the demands for people in our local area who can't get on the property ladder. So we can build smaller units at a lower profit rate that solves a problem in our community that if we weren't taking a profit, we wouldn't otherwise be able to afford and deliver. And that for me is really the core issue about reframing commercial. It's about doing what local government really should be doing, which is improving our local area to deliver better outcomes for our local population. And so taking a strategic look at your patch and your area, you can identify the problems that we all need to solve. And, we also start talking about then things like economic recovery coming out of the pandemic, issues around climate change and sustainability, all of which come with a price ticket. And we need to be looking at ways in which we can deliver against those strategic core agendas for us as a sector, but in a way that doesn't sacrifice or put at risk the financial sustainability of us as organisations. So I'm realistic enough to accept that the commercial approach is not going to solve all of the ills of local government finance. Adult social care, children's social services, the financial challenge there is not going to be solved by investment in the commercial world. But if you reframe the debate for a conversation around, well, what other improvements can we deliver within the patches that we're responsible, you can see many other benefits to local residents that can be delivered in a different way that also provide financial security and sustainable financial resources to the organisation that then again allow us to reinvest in our local place. And that for me is the importance of reframing this conversation around commercial and all the benefits that we can achieve. So thank you, Jonathan.
Many thanks indeed, Trevor. David Simmons, are you there? Are you able to come in?
I certainly am here. Chairman, can you hear me?
On videos, but
I don't know whether you can hear me at the moment, but I'm certainly here.
We can hear you perfectly. Talk away, David, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Well, in many ways, I'd like to start where that left off. I mean, the purpose of commercialism and commercialisation is to improve the ability of local authorities to serve their local community. And one of the things I found very striking in my many years in local government, engaged with other types of local authorities across Europe and in the wider world, is the extent to which local authorities in the UK are constrained in their ability to take commercial decisions in the interests of their residents. When we look at many of the things which our residents find frustrating, often those things have their root in the fact that whether it is planning, whether it is the financing of local public services, a lot of the control over those things sits with central government. Whereas in countries like Switzerland, for example, local authorities typically are also very large landowners, they're significant landlords. It's quite normal for both private and social tenants to occupy properties, to rent properties from the local authority. And that all forms part of the financial underpinnings that creates a degree of independence of that local authority from the national financial position, and creates much more freedom of action to take decisions in a way that reflects the needs of the community. In Germany, it's quite common for local authorities not merely to be providers of services to residents, but also to be significant economic players, shareholders in local businesses, perhaps involved in things like the banking system, with a role to play in supporting and sustaining the local economy in exactly the kind of way that levelling up begins to touch on in the UK. So I think the first big challenge we have is making sure that when we talk about levelling up and devolution for local authorities, we genuinely mean it, and that a few negative headlines about authorities using the inexpensive borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board to invest in property should not be allowed to distract from the huge benefits which residents, communities, and indeed our national economy would see from a much stronger level of local leadership. And the second big consideration, in my view, is that we need to look at alternative ways in which local authorities can finance their activities in the round. So we know that business rates localisation was certainly something which government were very keen to do, on a bit of a hold because of the impact of COVID. But a sense from business that the traditional model of business rates, which underpins the financing of a lot of local services, including things like the level of school funding, needs to move to something where local authorities have more flexibility and where there is a greater degree of business rate income retained locally. And against the backdrop of the challenge of a big shift to online shopping, a move to out of town business venues, that's clearly going to have a big impact on the bottom line. And ultimately for the Treasury, the challenge is if you move to a higher degree of localisation, there'll be big winners and losers. And the Treasury then needs to think about how it compensates the losers if public services in those areas are to be sustained. And moving to a situation where local authorities have a much wider range of financial flexibility and the ability to be far more autonomous in the way in which they deploy those resources has to be at the heart of that if we're going to make it possible for us to see a country in which we're able to operate with different incentives to attract business, to attract investment, to make sure that national infrastructure is able to proceed at the right pace, and that local communities are able to be positive and welcoming of development, whether that's housing or whether it's commercial, on the basis that their share of the proceeds and the benefits from that is enough to make it worth it, rather than, as is the case at the moment, it generally does not cover the costs to a local authority through things like a Section 106 agreement that are imposed by the development that has taken place. So commercialisation means being able, in my view, to have a much more autonomous and flexible approach to the way in which finances are managed at a local level. Jonathan, back to you.
Many thanks indeed, David, and also Andrew, Trevor, Jonathan, for filling the opening remarks. They're covering a lot of ground: strategic leadership, creation of public value, the Green Paper on procurement reform, the role of knowledge in place, as well as that connection between localisation, levelling up, and how we go about the wider funding of local public services. That's all good, mum, apple pie and local government, but we need to bring this out to debate. So I'm going to invite colleagues and webinar participants to throw in some questions into the Q&A box for the panelists to answer amongst ourselves. Meantime, just a quick one question to the panel. Clearly, what's driven all of this is that kind of media narrative, and I guess for local government and the local state, compared to, we can talk about this a lot, but it doesn't change anything. Complaint never changes anything or too much in life. That whereby other branches of the public services, there can be multiple failures of very bad nature. There's never that wholesale condemnation of, say, the NHS after, say, an Alder Hey or mid-staff crisis. But for local government, Croydon, North Hampshire, suddenly the whole sector gets tarred. And clearly for, I guess for central government, I guess the concern is, well, we don't want the bad publicity of councils being seen to fail, because it makes everyone look bad. And that wider issue of, well, look, there's that kind of sense of moral hazard creeping in, which is the sense we can't be seen to be bailing out authorities that have failed. That does seem to be sort of stifling, from our perspective, that appetite for good place investment. Clearly, Andrew, work at SIPFA guidance coming out later in the autumn on kind of wider commercial activity. But are we ever going to change that kind of central local narrative, in the sense that blame ought to be localised in these instances, but the whole sector gets it? Is there a way of maybe transforming what is ultimately a poisonous narrative into some kind of remedy or vaccine to say, well, look, there are bad examples, but there's so many good examples. This is a contemporary, good practice that can deliver for residents. What might it take to change the narrative, especially in terms of central government views as well as media spins on things? Anyone like to open up on that? Or not, as the case may be.
Shall I start, Jonathan, in the absence of any other volunteers? So I think there's having in my introduction talked about the benefits of a multi-dimensional approach to anything. I won't attempt to boil this down to a silver bullet. I think there's a few things that can be done. So the first thing to say is that these things are inevitably more interesting as headlines when the detail behind them has been private up until then. If you don't believe me about that, just ask Matt Hancock. So the more that local authorities can do to make their plans public and known and transparent upfront, the better. You can take relatively risky investments if you have a clear risk appetite that's communicated within your organisation to partners and to customers, typically residents, businesses, communities, but however you define those. You can mitigate it further with one of the main things that we are advocating through the report, which is explicitly linking commercial activity to the creation of public value. So as you know, Jonathan, one of the things that we identified in our report is that an early driver for commercialism in local government was essentially commercialism as a last resort to achieving financial sustainability. And that appears to have led to a number of high-profile failures that the public and central government have been fairly unforgiving of, because it was viewed in some cases as some reckless risks being taken in order to achieve financial sustainability, where there was a perception that you could have done that through other means, whether that was demand management or a different view to local taxation, different relationship with the communities, asking them to do different things. So where there are alternatives and commercial things have gone wrong, public appear to be fairly unforgiving of that. If you have a strategy that is more akin to Trevor's fantastic plug for tourism and inward investment there, which is that your commercial strategy is intrinsically linked to the development of a strong place brand and the development of the local area. And you can demonstrate that what you're doing is a lever for creating public value. In the same way that a bunch of other non-controversial now initiatives like digital transformation is a lever for creating public value, I think you can get over any concerns or apprehensions about that. But the more that you can put in the public domain and be transparent, fundamentally link it to your corporate strategy and your sustainable communities plan, rather than kind of see it as an add-on that's kept secret and redacted from minutes of meetings, the more forgiving the public is likely to be when things go wrong, in my view.
Many thanks for boldly going forward there, Jonathan. Trevor or Andrew or David, anyone else want to pick up on the David?
Jonathan, yeah, I agree. One of the big challenges, of course, is for central government to be courageous and be willing to accept that there will be things that will come out that will be seen as negative, in exactly the way that we already see. And local authorities have a lot of discretion about the way they manage certain local services. And it's always frustrating when, on one hand, government says local authorities should be looking at all opportunities to bridge a budget gap, but then objecting when they do that by raising parking charges or something like that. But the other big factor I think it's important for local government to think about collectively is that a lot of the current challenges reflect the fact that the new homes bonus income has accrued to district authorities, who then often had a greater degree of freedom of action, whilst strategic authorities in those areas that are two-tier, county councils with responsibilities for things like adult social care, where there have been enormous and growing financial pressures over the last decade, have struggled. So there is a degree to which, certainly within the local government sector, there's a risk of authorities of different kinds playing beggar my neighbour. And I think we need to make sure that there is a clear narrative that says from the local government sector that this is what we see positively as the way forward, as opposed to saying, the income that's accrued to this type of authority should instead go to another one because they have a more important set of challenges, because that effectively just puts the decision back to the centre again, where what we want to see is much greater freedom of action at a local level for all types of authorities.
David, many thanks for that interjection. I think it's only fair to put, you've got your hand up, Trevor, tell us about your new homes bonus largesse. Go on.
Yeah, probably not the way I'd describe it, Jonathan, but so yeah, I mean, I agree kind of largely with what the previous speakers have said in answering the question, and I think as a sector we do need to be more joined up in that conversation around local government finance, and move away from ongoing debates around restructuring, reorganisation. I think they kind of tend not to be the most productive conversations that we have within the sector. But I think really in answering your question, I think there's probably two different points I would just like to highlight. I think one is about the maturity of the conversation that we have with central government, and actually a recognition and an understanding that commercial for me is just simply a vehicle for delivering my organisation's corporate plan. And my organisation's corporate plan agenda, in large part, delivers what central government wants us to deliver. So how anybody loses in that situation if we're successful, I struggle with, actually. So actually we just need to understand and be more sophisticated in the way that we present the conversation around commercial to that sort of organisation, and that's where your paper kind of really helps. And I think the other aspect of it is that as a sector we are traditionally poor at celebrating success. We are very shy about telling the positive stories of what we've achieved for fear of criticism, because there'll always be somebody out there who wants to criticise what we actually deliver. But actually, by demonstrating that some of these investments and some of these commercial projects have delivered benefits within your place, again, telling our local communities that success story actually acts as a balancing where, occasionally investments may go wrong. But I still come back to the core strategic point about the fact that if we're investing in things that are for the betterment of our local area, when something goes wrong, the public are far more understanding of why we set out on that journey in the first place than if we are simply taking taxpayers' money and buying commercial property 200 miles away that serves no benefit for our local residents. So I think as long as we're kind of keeping that focus on delivering for our local area, then it's much harder to attract poor publicity when things go wrong, because there's a very sensible narrative that we put around it.
Trevor, many thanks indeed for a fulsome response to that. Andrew Burns, can I ask you to come and give the SITFA full view on this?
Just on that point, building on those two previous points, I think the importance of openness and transparency, and councils be able to explain why they're doing what it is that they're doing, I think is key. And in thinking then about risk, being explicit about what the upside gain might be and what the downside risk might be. And often there's less attention devoted to the risk of not doing things as there is as the risk of doing things. But ultimately, it's the point I made in my introductory remarks about not hiding behind a cloak of commercial confidentiality in these considerations and doing it in a way that's open and transparent, much more likely to get local traction and local support, particularly if you can demonstrate that if things don't work out, the council has the ability to cope with maybe the income loss or the failure to deliver on income expected without it bringing the sort of the financial viability of the organisation to some sort of peril or deterioration. So that openness, transparency point, I think, is really, really key. And that means good governance and good scrutiny. Thank you.
Not obviously what work's ongoing, but how do you see those SITFA's ongoing guidance into this helping to inform better practice across local government, Andrew?
Well, I think the bit of the guidance that's got most attention is the business about borrowing for commercial yield. And as I said at the start, that's just one small part of this broader debate. There are a range of other bits of guidance around sustainable investment, about better procurement, about good governance, which I think has got an equally important role to play to help and support councils deal with this space, rather than just the narrow bit about the things that you can't do because the government regulations have changed. So reframing the debate in the context of what councils can do and do well, I think is probably more fruitful than just going back to the here are things that you can't do in accordance with this bit of guidance. That's a very, very narrow bit of the commercial space in SITFA's view.
Many thanks, Andrew. So we've got some questions coming in. Let's have a look. Question about culture. Now, Colin's got a very good one. Famously, sort of, what's the old phrase? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. He asks, how much of an issue of skills gap and the challenges of the commercial public sector cultural fit? So in this, is there a matter of exploitation or one being put over, as used to be said was the case around local government procurement, whereby we have the buyers might be outclassed by their technically or commercially by the counterparts, saying to them, how much is this about commercial fit? Jonathan, can I ask you to answer first on this? In the report, they made a great mention of the importance of culture. How do you
yeah, thanks, Jonathan. With your permission, Chair, I'd like to tie in my response to another question that I've seen come in, which is about political ideology as well. So I guess that's another part of an organisation's culture. So it's certainly true that like any discipline, the level of commercial maturity and commercial skill across local government is patchwork. You'd expect that. There's some really, really good examples. Lots of authorities have done a very good job of both developing commercial skills with their existing in-house talent and specifically attracting people who've already got those skills from the private sector into the organisation. People have done that to lesser or greater extents. That's exactly what you'd expect. Some organisations are stronger at commissioning, others are digital, so that's quite normal. There's been an effort to introduce common standards for commercial skills through the development of a commercial skills framework. So that was originally developed by government commercial function for central government departments and bodies. It was then adapted by the LGA to be relevant to local authorities. it's quite focused on the procurement side of this, which is, not to be underestimating the importance of that. As you mentioned, the ability to negotiate commercial value from £290 billion of public sector third-party expenditure shouldn't be underestimated. One of the themes in there is about income generation, although that appears to relate mainly to the income generation you would build into contracts, so concession contracts for advertising or gain share arrangements for the delivery of leisure services or savings programs or whatever. There's no explicit commercial skills framework that I'm aware of that covers the entire breadth of commercial activity that is in scope of our paper. So the full income generation side, the how you use a generally more entrepreneurial mindset and culture in your organization to transform processes to be more customer friendly and more efficient. That doesn't exist, other than, of course, in our fantastic commercial academy, which some people here might have been on a program from. But I will tell you a short story about that ties into the question about political ideology. So we ran one of our commercial academy programs for a local authority who put 100 of their staff through it across all departments, and it went down pretty well. But one of the prevailing concerns that people had, the issues that they said that they faced, was that officers felt in this particular authority that they often had really good commercial ideas that were blocked by members. And so an example was given of a very popular annual event that they would organise, and it was always oversubscribed. Tickets were a fairly nominal fee, and they wanted to put the ticket price up just a little bit to make it more in line with what commercial events organisers in the areas would charge. Members were absolutely against that, and that's a relatively small example. It wouldn't have been a massive revenue stream for the authority, but it sent a message that people could come up with ideas that were entrepreneurial and dynamic and generating a bit of extra revenue, but they felt like those ideas were blocked for political reasons, and that the full business decision that you would take into consideration wasn't always considered. My personal experience is that that sort of view is not attached to a political ideology if we're talking about party politics specifically. So we held a conference last year where we had leaders from 3 councils representing a Labour, Conservative and a Liberal Democrat administration. They all broadly had the same view of what it means to be commercial in the public sector, and there was a lot of complementary views there. So I don't think it's about party politics, but occasionally you get a local cohort of members who aren't on board with every commercial opportunity. And I'm sure in turn, some members would say often a lot of great commercial ideas come from members and they struggle to get them implemented in the organisation.
Many thanks indeed, Jonathan. Anyone, let's take these questions in the round then. Who's got hands up? Andrew first, then Trevor.
Yeah, just quickly, just in terms of the skills gap question, I think there's a technical skills issue about procurement and trading, for example, but there's also something about commercial is about being customer focused and pacey and innovative. There's no reason at all why the best councils don't and can't address those sort of issues. So no, whilst there might be in some places at some times a potential issue there, there's nothing about the nature of either the technical or the cultural dimensions of being commercial that the best councils couldn't address. I think on the political ideology point, I mean, I've worked for Labour councils, Conservative councils, councils with no rural control, and actually there is no direct correlation. Political philosophy of the local leadership is really important. Some Conservative councils have been very clear in their ambition to maximise all income streams to become self-financing. Equally, others take the view that they should not compete with the private sector and crowd out private investment. Now, there are some Labour councils who take commercial approaches to maximise trading to avoid service cuts, and others who think actually they're philosophically opposed to any sort of private provision or trading. So I don't think there is a correlation nor consistency. The key point here about political ideology is you need to do whatever it is that matches your local political philosophy and ideology and your local political priorities. And if that doesn't work, there are other things to focus on.
Many thanks, Andrew. Trevor, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I think they're both really good questions, actually, because I think the cultural question is a really good challenge. And if I reflect back on the journey that we've been on as an organisation over probably the last 5 or so years in terms of the whole concept of commercial, it has been really important to get the buy-in from all levels across the organisation. And that does take a bit of a push in terms of articulating what we want from the culture of the organisation. Because I think, again, and what was really important for us as an organisation was being clear about what we meant by commercialisation at the beginning and what the commercial agenda meant to us as an organisation. Because if I'd have asked all of my staff, I'd have got a whole spectrum of responses to that. And quite often the conversation around commercial is, again, that negative end of the spectrum in terms of, well, this means investing tens of millions of pounds in buying commercial offices. So isn't that commercial? Well, that's not, I mean, it is, but it's at one extreme. So in my organisation, actually, there were many commercial gains to be made by individuals taking greater responsibility and reflecting on the way that they delivered their services and doing it slightly differently. But first and foremost, what we had to do as an organisation was to introduce them to the concept of what being commercial actually meant, and in a way that was digestible and understandable. And I'll give a plug to Human Engine, who came in and did a lot of good work across my organisation in giving that sort of initial introduction to what we mean by commercial. And as a result of that, I had staff coming back to me with ideas around, well, actually, we could tweak things like our street naming and numbering policies to introduce smaller charges that meant developers paid a little bit more money in order to change the way that the streets were named when new developments came about. That was a great example of a commercial activity that produced kind of £25,000 extra into my budget. It didn't need a big ticket issue. It meant the service was still provided in the same, or actually a slightly better way, but it was commercial thinking at a small scale, and those sorts of things add up. So we're not always kind of looking at mass scale introduction of ideas. And I think that's where it's really important to get the cultural piece right, because what you want is people to be challenging each other and thinking about different ways. That doesn't require a corporate management team to come in and say, actually, have you thought about X? What you're looking is for everybody across the organization to challenge themselves. And what that also brings then is improvements to customer service has been talked about, and improvements to the way we operate, and improvements to the efficiency of how we work, as well as generating a return or an increase in terms of the income to us as an organisation. So it's really important. And on the political point, absolutely agree with what's been said. If I look even just in my county, in East Sussex, there's 5 districts and boroughs and the county council. Most of them are under different levels of political control, be it Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative, no overall control. And we've all got a shared story and narrative around the sorts of activities that we're undertaking under the banner of being commercial. So I don't think there is an overriding political philosophy that's driving councils. Again, I think it's back to that point around all local politicians, whatever their political colour, are about improving their place, and will do so in a way that they feel is right. And I don't think the politics necessarily comes into it or overlays it particularly. So, you know, again, it's an interesting one. You know, I take the example of my organisation. Actually, we're one of the few councils in the country that don't charge for car parking. 5 years ago, if I said to my staff, we need commercial ideas, every single one of them would come back to me and say, why don't we charge for car parking? Well, actually, the local political philosophy is that contributes to the sustainability of the market towns, because it attracts shoppers and visitors, and therefore it's a perfect trade-off. So we now accept that that's a political decision that can sit comfortably alongside a commercial strategy. Everybody understands that. So again, it's important about having that conversation with your politicians, where the red lines are, what their risk they're prepared to take, where they want to see commercial going, and then you can define that for the whole of the organisation and get the cultural piece right. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Trevor. David, can I invite you to respond to those issues raised around sort of culture, ethos between the public and the private sector, as well as whether political ideology plays any role in how effective or strategic councils might be in their commercial strategies?
But it tends to be a lack of mutual respect, in my experience, between the public sector generally and the private sector. Having spent my time outside of politics working in the private sector in some very large and some smaller businesses, it's very clear that in some cases I would absolutely bet on a local council in terms of its efficiency, its business acumen, its effectiveness, to come in well ahead of some of those commercial businesses, and others not so much the case. And clearly, you know, culture will vary enormously, as will the experience of members, chief officers, and those with a strategic responsibility from place to place. The key thing to me seems to be recognising that there are differences, and the point about the ability of a local authority to take a much more long-term view about the way it deploys borrowing, I think is a critical difference, that where most businesses would be looking at a relatively short term on which to seek a payoff. Even a commercial mortgage tends to be 20, 25 years at the absolute most. But most businesses will be looking for a pretty swift return. There are investors and there are local authorities that will be able to take a view over sometimes 50 or more years about the benefit that comes to the community from a particular investment decision. And so seeing people who understand that important cultural difference and understand its implications is clearly critical. And it appears to me that that's an area where we could do a bit more work, and in particular look at the links between organisations that traditionally do take a long-term view of investment approaches, such as pension funds, and how the expertise that may sit there could be brought in to aid the commercial decisions of local authorities, as opposed to, as we sometimes have seen, outsourcing of that with a view to making a quick return, which often does bring some benefits, but the scale of those benefits is nothing like enough to make a transformational difference to the finances of a local authority.
Many thanks indeed, David. And thanks for raising again the issue of long-term issues, as well as levelling up improvements in place and funding sources. John Beasley brings that up. He asks, what's the scope for a more joined up and strategic approach to commercialisation of infrastructure and housing across an area, perhaps a wider area beyond more than a single authority? Is there a role for joining up with other authorities or in larger areas to align elements of commercialisation with infrastructure and housing? Anyone want to take that one on? Trevor, thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, I think it depends on, I think, largely the risk appetite of the organisations themselves, and I guess how much you can align the objectives of the respective organisations. I think if we are, again, focusing on place, it becomes more difficult to invest the money that we're responsible for in an area that's a significant difference or location away. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not the right thing to do. Certainly in my area, we've had many conversations around sharing knowledge and expertise across the creation of things like housing companies, that while maybe the individual housing companies operate within the respective council's boundaries, they actually, the knowledge in order to create them, there's an ability to share that and share the journeys and experiences that we've got. But there will be investment projects that are of a scale that actually it's appropriate to share risk across borders and across boundaries. We've had conversations with neighbouring authorities around things like solar farms, and certainly within my neighbouring urban authorities, it's quite difficult for them to find the land and the space to deliver something of that sort of scale. And actually there may well be some sense in terms of us joining up for shared investment in something like that delivers a return and a benefit to everybody. So I think it's about the maturity of the conversation across time. And I think that's probably the other point I'd make for us as organisations, is that certainly in terms of that skills piece, you can't learn these skills overnight. You need to go on a kind of slightly incremental journey, and for us it's been small steps in order to prove the concept before then moving on to larger and larger projects. And once we've built up the confidence and the knowledge and the skills, or brought in the skills that we need, then we can start moving on to larger scale projects which involve working with other authorities. So I think there will come a time when naturally we will start looking at joint investments across the piece. For my organisation, we're probably just reaching that point now, and I think as a sector we'll continue to develop that. So yeah, I think it's a really good challenge and a good question for us to think about where next in terms of commercial across the sector.
Excellent. Anyone else like to chip in from the panel on longer term, broader area? And okay, Jonathan, take it on.
Just to point people to what I think is a really good example. If you're interested in seeing how this has been done in practice and to learn more, I would point people in the direction of Cheltenham Borough Council. So Cheltenham's another organisation that we've worked with to do some commercial skills, business case training. They took that to a level beyond the next level with their Golden Valley development. So that's their flagship economic development, regen, commercial growth programme, ties in all of those key strategic strands of using infrastructure, development, housing, local skills, employment opportunities, education as a means to create a really strong place-based brand, which is one of the key recommendations of our report. So Cheltenham Borough Council is the lead, and it's a hugely ambitious programme, certainly for a district council to be leading on something of that scale. But the conversation they had with members was the risk of not doing it was greater than the risk of doing it. Working with a whole range of partners so that the development spills over into a neighbouring district that they're working with, two-tier structure, so clearly working with the county council as well. I can't say the central government agency that they're working with, but it's a government intelligence agency locally based at Cheltenham. And also working with local employers, education. So the whole scheme is about establishing that region as the centre for the cyber economy in the UK, beautifully tying together all of the strands of commercial development, local place-based branding, creation of public value, jobs and housing. So lots of information available online if people are interested in that case study. Many thanks, Jonathan. Now, unlike the football, today isn't going to extra time, let alone the dread prospect of penalties. So I'm going to wrap things up quickly now. And what I'll do is invite our panelists in turn, maybe to give a couple of bullet points, reflections from today's debate, and maybe any suggestions you might have for improving the commercial journey as an improvement journey for local government as a sector. So sorry to put you on the spot first, Andrew, but someone's got to take the first spot kick. Any sort of final reflection from you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Interesting discussion, and thanks for the opportunity to be involved in it. And one of the great strengths of the sector is the ability to share in an open and transparent way about people's experiences without hiding behind that cloak of commercial inconfidence about intellectual property. So there's something in that. I think having a clear strategy to explain how being commercial fits with that strategy, and then being clear about why as well as what, I think is key. And then being able to sell that to the local population, as many others have said. Local politicians first and foremost they do what they do to improve the place for the people that they serve, and it's about how do we ensure that commercial strategies and commercial approaches contribute to that broader and wider strategy for the place and its citizens. And if you do that in an open and transparent way, where you're conscious about the risks of both doing it and not doing it, there's a much better chance, I think, for there to be a proper, reasonable debate about it, rather than one which is the sort of the negative headline-driven one that has characterised much of the last couple of years.
Take away that cloak of confidentiality. Jonathan, over to you. A few quick bullet points, summary recollections, and suggestions for improvement going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So my overarching observation is that I'm so disappointed at the consensus that we've all achieved today and the lack of friction, contention. We pitched this as a debate and we all agreed on almost every issue. We need to bring in someone more bombastic next time, put a bit of grit in our commercial oyster. But I guess that means, given that we've got a range of perspectives here across the panelists and we're all broadly reaching consensus, albeit flavouring it with our own experience and perspectives, that we're probably on to something fairly convincing in terms of the direction of travel. Agree wholeheartedly with what Andrew's just said. So I mean, we are a consultancy that strongly advocates that local authorities take a commercial approach to solving the problems of modern public sector service delivery. But even I would not say start with commercial and finish with commercial. That's the be all and end all. So start with your strategy for your place, develop that as broadly and collaboratively as possible. So no single part of the public sector in a given geography has complete ownership of that identity, the place, the brand, the strategy. Collaborate with other parts of the public sector system, with residents, with communities, businesses, employers, education. Following on from that, then develop your organizational strategy and your commercial strategy in parallel. The commercial strategy will support both of those things. So your big strategic plans for the geography will be supported by your big commercial schemes. Your organizational strategy will be reinforced by the skills and culture program that you put in your commercial strategy. So if you think about those things as a trinity of helpful documents and plans, but with places at the top of it. And if people do want some practical tips for how to get started and some of the things to include in that, our commercial maturity model, which is included in the Localis Human Engine report, I would recommend to you as a great place to start.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Trevor, we're into time added on for stoppages. Very quick kind of bullet points from you, please.
Well, I think largely Andrew and Jonathan have covered it, I have to say. I think what's really helpful is that there's enough experience across the sector now for us to be able to share the journeys and share success stories. So people who are setting out or kind of fairly early on in the move across to developing commercial ideas, there's a wealth of information out there for people to learn from. And as Andrew said, I think one of the great strengths of the sector is the fact that we're prepared to share ideas and share lessons, be they good or bad, actually, in terms of what's worked, so others can learn from our mistakes. But I think, you know, as others have said, take it as a strategic approach. Don't do things ad hoc. Be clear about what you're trying to achieve, and actually have that mature conversation with your members. I think, as has been said, I don't believe that most politicians, if any, ever go to be elected on a platform of doing less in their patch. They all want to kind of actually do more and improve things. So actually use commercial as the vehicle for delivering improvements in your local area. And then I think you'll find that you buy in a lot of momentum. But start small. You know, don't take significant commercial risks if you don't feel that you've got the skills. Take your time and learn it, and take a longer term view over your place. And then I think we can all be successful in reframing that conversation around what commercial means.
Many thanks, Trevor. And final word, please, to David Simmons.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think the key thing that I would add to that is that the reputation of the sector is absolutely critical to make progress on this. We hear quite a lot of negative things about the commercial acumen of our municipal entrepreneurs, but actually our municipal entrepreneurs have a long and extremely honourable history of making a brilliant contribution to the improvement of public services and the improvement of public life in general. So I think it's really important that councils are promoting the good news stories, are talking about the capabilities of members and chief officers, many of whom have a lot of experience in the private commercial sector. And of course, it's characteristic of many of those authorities that are invested in property that often we see when we look at the detail that the members who've made those decisions are highly experienced property professionals in their non-political lives and have brought that to the benefit of the public. I think we need to be really, really positive in talking that up and make sure that we win the argument that letting local authorities be commercial is a good thing for the future. It is not something that should be seen as an unacceptable risk.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
Many thanks indeed, David. Many thanks indeed, all our panelists. I'm going to blow the final whistle on today's debate. Thank you, everyone, for a very enjoyable conversation, raising the key issues from the report. And we'll send out a copy of the link to the report for those who haven't got it. Thanks to you for everyone who registered to take part in the conversation today. Bring that conversation forward. The fat lady's going to sing now, so I'm going to say thank you to everyone for today. Gratitude's always the attitude. We hope to continue the conversation sometime in the future with you. Thanks, everyone. All the best now.
Thank you. All right.
We'll be over tonight.